All right, so now that we've kind of covered the circular flow of income and expenditure, we can think about one of the broadest kind of measures of aggregate economic activity, which is gross domestic product. So gross domestic product. Kind of mentioned it last week in our module when we kind of introduced this idea of output. We kind of talked about gross domestic product. We're just going to take a closer look and give an actual definition this week, so we know exactly what it is and how we're calculating it. All right, so gross domestic product. So maybe I'll write down that it's one of the broadest measures of aggregate, so total, that's what I mean by aggregate, economic activity. Let's give a more formal definition of it. So the formal definition of GDP is going to be the market value. We're going to parse this out in the next video, or in a couple minutes in this one. The market value of all final goods and services produced within a country in a given time period. Period. And so in a couple minutes, we'll kind of parse the language or take a closer look at this language and talk about what we mean by market value, kind of what's included, what's not in terms of all final goods and services. There's some things that are going to be omitted, and kind of what we mean by produced within a country in a given time period. So we'll parse out that language in a couple minutes. But in general, we can think of there's three different ways of calculating GDP, and they should all give us the same number. They're just kind of different approaches to calculating it. Methods to calculate GDP. So there's kind of three methods. The first one is going to be the value added. And so with this method, you're basically looking at each stage of production. So when produce one product goes through different stages of production. And these stages of production add value to the product. So one way of kind of calculating GDP, or this measure of aggregate economic activity, is just to add up all the value added at each level of production. It would be domestic production, everything produced within, all the value added within Canada, for instance. The second is going to be using the idea of that circular flow of income and expenditure we just looked at, and it would be the expenditure approach. Expenditure approach. And here you'd be calculating all the total expenditures on domestic production. And the final method is, so that's one side of the income and expenditure circular flow. And the other way to do it is from the other side of that income and expenditure circular flow. So the expenditure side, then we had the income side. So total income. So the income approach is total income produced by domestic production. And these should all give us the same amount. They're just kind of different ways of calculating it. Like we said, kind of the income and the expenditure should be the same, just thinking about that circular flow, just using different sides of this circular flow to calculate total economic activity. And this value added method just kind of looks at the value you're adding at each stage of production. And it'd be all the stages of production within the country you're looking at. All right, so here's our definition of GDP. So the market, we just covered that. The market value of all final goods and services produced within a country in a given time period. Let's just parse the language to take a closer look at this definition. So the first thing we might want to talk about is what we mean by this market value. Well, that just means prices. So market value current prices. We'll talk about nominal versus real GDP in a few more minutes, and whether we use prices from a base year or the current year prices to calculate this GDP. So that's what we mean by market value. So next thing we should talk about is all. So when we say all final goods and services, we don't actually mean all of them, because we're going to omit certain things, and some of these categories might be fairly significant. So it's going to omit illegal activities. It's going to omit leisure. So we might value leisure, but that doesn't, even though we value it, it's not going to be included in GDP. It's not going to include the underground economy. So when you do things, you just pay cash and you don't actually kind of pay taxes on something, things like that. That's not going to be included in GDP. It's not going to include home production. So all the work you do at home, whether that's all the work you do on your house or your apartment or the cleaning or the painting, if you hired someone else to do it, that would be included in GDP. But if you do it yourself, that's not going to be included. Finally, economic bads. So maybe things like pollution and things like that, that's not going to be included in GDP. It's not going to be subtracted from GDP. It's not taking into account those economic bads. So these are, even though we said all final goods and services, we are excluding certain things that we might place value on. So goods and services, so we're including both goods and services. I guess that kind of makes sense. Or it's kind of self-evident. It includes both goods and the services provided, and services are becoming a more and more important part of our economy. Produced within a country. Within a country. So all economic production within a country, regardless of who owns regardless of who owns that that production. Regardless of who owns the factor of production. So what I mean by that is, there's someone from another country that's working in Canada and they're producing something in Canada, they're contributing to Canadian GDP. We're going to talk about a different measure, GNP, which is going to be about who owns the factor of production. And so, for instance, if I was working in the States, I'd be contributing to American or the US GDP, even though I'm Canadian. And the last one is we just have to define a time period in a given time period. So it's calculated over a specific time period. That could be quarterly, it could be yearly, whatever it's going to be. But we have to define it over a set time period. So that's just like a closer look at this definition of GDP, so we actually know what's included and what's not.